So lots of you have heard of the FAO-derived REMA, the Resilience Index methodology. So you create an index for resilience. And in the Somali context, we wanted to embed that very much in qualitative inputs and validation from communities themselves. So the first step was qualitative, very open-ended community consultations and a different range of understanding the local definition of resilience even, to inform the design of the survey. So the second step is designing that survey. It was based on an LSMS World Bank survey, but with the community consultations, we could change elements of it to be locally specific, everything from what their coping strategies are, to include in a coping strategies index, to a module on psychological well-being or psychosocial well-being, which came out from conversations with them as very critical to resilience, even when all the assets and capacities are there. So then the idea is, after a survey, you validate it qualitatively. You take it back and say, this is what we think we understood. Can you help us understand that? And from that, you design the next quantitative step. So this building of steps, where you're not just piling qual and quant up, you're complementing, you're sort of iterating one with the other. So that was the justification of that. And then the next, that's where we did it. As I said, it was based on the LSMS World Bank survey, which has a huge amount of breadth, which is problematic because it requires a lot of time from communities. But there you are, trying to understand this broad basket of indicators and look for connections between them. So you also are able to use a bigger survey to tackle different levels. So it's still a household survey, but for example, it has this individual level psychological module in. It has a perceptions module, which asks about governance and systems. So it's predominantly household, but an entry point for other levels. Now this is where the REMA comes from. So on the left is the alchemy of it. That R at the top is the resilience index. So it's a latent variable derived from 5 other latent subvariables. So this is basically the analytical framework. The one on the left is productive sectors, livelihoods related. Then you've got access to basic services, then social safety nets, then shocks, shock sensitivity, shock intensity. And that is in many cases where we see a departure in terms of this analysis from the ones we've done before. And then adaptive capacity is the final one. So those 5 are the pillars, and they're also latent variables, but underneath them are clusters of observable variables. You aggregate, so every household gets a score based on this equation, and you aggregate it by livelihood, and you can rank them. And this is only so useful because, as we know, livelihoods are very dynamic, even within a household, but over time, over space. So we used FSNAU livelihood classifications as categories to think with, but I think they're very limited. And the first thing that that communities said when they heard of these scores is, but how can you group a camel herding pastoralist with a low-level pastoralist who has just a few shoats? You can't put them all in these groups. What we understood beneath the indexes is how each pillar contributes to the index. So, for example, the 5 points of the radar are the 5 pillars, and you can see, if you compare left the pastoralist radar, how their index was made up, with the right, how the urban one was made up. It's fairly similar. And then coming down underneath, there were livelihoods that were more different, but if you come down underneath, that's where it gets interesting. You break apart a pillar into which variables made the bigger difference. So for urban livelihood groups, they were the only ones where electricity made a difference, because everywhere else it's not there. But in urban livelihoods, the fact that you do or don't have electricity impacts how much you can study, how much your business opens after hours. So it makes a difference. And then on the left, pastoralist, what makes a massive difference is distance to services, access to services, because the range of access to services among pastoralist households is so huge. So going on, another way of presenting those findings is by terciles. So within each livelihood group, if every household gets a resilience index, you can line them all up and make the top tercile, the middle tercile, and the bottom tercile. And you can see what variables were different between those. So it's another way of looking at the sort of pop chart of what makes a difference within a livelihood between higher and lower resilience. So on the left pastoralist, you can see, well, there's lots of, yes, access to services, hugely determining of the different resilience among pastoralist households, and higher participation in different employment. So again, that's back to the Mercy Corps issue of livelihood diversification, but again, the sort of the quality, not the quantity of diversification. And then over on urban resilience, again, what was quite interesting there was the livestock owned made a huge difference across even urban livelihood zones, and that was one of our findings, that livestock across the livelihood zones is hugely determinant of resilience. So that was another way of presenting and unpacking each group. Then if we keep going, okay, so looking at some of the key findings that we teased out of this, I think the pastoralist data was interesting because it showed us the difference between what we'd done here and a vulnerability analysis that we might have done 2 years ago. So they came out as the least resilient. And again, the caveat is this is very much an aggregate of quite diverse scores, and any Somali pastoralist would tell you, you simply can't put them all in one bracket. But we have done, and we've looked at where that departs from what we understood before about their vulnerability. So to take a nutritionist perspective, which I think is quite informative here, they might look at a certain slice in time at pastoralist vulnerability as not too bad. There's the milk, there's the assets, there's the mobility, the coping, and this almost fabled resilience of a mobile pastoralist. But that is one point in time. And when you put in the shock dimension and the dynamism that a resilience analysis has to have, you can see how the vulnerability changes with a shock or with a chronic stress. So you see it's very brittle. You look, and this is what a nutritionist would be able to back up. You see a crash much harder and faster than in another livelihood group, because the assets can evaporate much more quickly. In the same way, they can be built up just as quickly, but that's where you get a distinction between this idea that they can have very low resilience, even if we looked at them at certain points in time and considered their vulnerability not too worrying compared to other groups. So back to the mixed methods, sorry, if you go back one, that backs up with, for example, how people explained it. Surgudud, which was a mixed livelihood zone outside Dolo. The old guy who says many of those who herded livestock are now weaker than others because all their animals died in the drought. Those who have farms might still be struggling to farm their land, so they're on this more gradual decline, but those who lost their animals have nothing, as though it was very much an overnight shock. And then moving, another of the things we were looking at, urban households. I know we don't think in South Central of Somali urbanization as particularly acute on the scale of the rest of this region, but if you look at some of the trajectories, it is on a very steep urbanization curve, lower than Kenya obviously and places like that. But by 2050 it's estimated that 50 to 60% of Somali will be urban populations. So we're really trying to see this as our blind spot and a category we needed to better understand. Obviously it's very diverse and it was very distinct when you looked at what makes an urban household more or less resilient compared to others, assets, things like electricity. But also this, as I mentioned, the livestock ownership was very high. We need to disaggregate this better. I mean, there was a lot of interesting information, but what it threw up, frankly, was that people move in and out of urban livelihoods very intensely, and wouldn't necessarily consider themselves urban, and within a household would be practicing different, what we would call rural livelihoods. So that's an area for much more inquiry. Women, yes, like everyone else who's done a baseline, we're caught between, typically regarding them as this vulnerable group that need our support, but acknowledging that their adaptive capacity and transformative capacity can be quite formidable. And that's certainly what a lot of female informants will tell you. There's huge amounts of vulnerability, but when they talk about their ability to get on and do it, to stand up and fight against some of these overriding and often very crushing factors, it's very formidable. And what we saw were that female-headed households had higher resilience scores than male-headed ones. Also, of course, there were more women. It was the classic sort of war demographic pyramid with a big bite taken out of the male side between 25 and 39. And they talk about not having the same sort of barriers in terms of diversification. They can diversify any which way. So we're looking at the dynamism, the resilience, and what Mercy Corps call the untapped adaptive capacity we need to recognise, while we also see the vulnerability, which is acute. And then the next one is probably coming. Probably access to basic services made a huge difference, which is very interesting for us, if I may step outside the jointness of the strategy for a minute, because the resilience debate is very often colonised by food security, livelihoods. But if you look at access to basic services, it makes a huge difference between whether you're actually able to be productive and have a robust livelihood or not. So probably without asking you to look at that, the looking forward is that this has to be very iterative, it has to go alongside programming, and that you have to qualify and validate each step throughout. We're being pushed for much closer interaction with the community perceptions of their resilience. It is their resilience, not our definition of it. And the panel data is an important aspect of this, while at the same time we know that we're always behind the curve. Basically, we're looking at 2013 resilience in Dolo, and is that going to be the same set of ingredients as 2015 resilience to the same or different shocks? No. So again, we're pushed back to qualifying and validating this with communities and using them as the predictive analysis, using youth, for example, to explain resilience in that dynamic way that it needs to be understood. Then Steve's last question about attribution, I think that's the hardest one of all. I mean, at the moment we're looking at how resilience will change, will stand or fall, whether we can assess how much we've contributed to that in a place as shifting as Somalia or anywhere is definitely the next challenge.
Why did the model find it difficult to include institutions and governance into the model? Was it due to chronic insecurity, or was it the model itself? And can you discuss the lessons learnt?
Take that one first?
Yes,
okay.
Please.
Well, it was a household level questionnaire, which came really from the idea that in South Central Somalia, at least, we were going to start building resilience at a household and community level. We were talking about households that were on the move. It didn't matter to them what governance did or didn't exist, what systems did or didn't exist. We were looking at the sort of behavioural care practices, knowledge, local level governance that even if they're on the move will give them a resilience. That's where we could support it. So it did start with a household level questionnaire. Having said that, I do believe you can use a household questionnaire for some degree of higher level inquiry. So there's a set of questions on it's perceptions of. So again, it comes with a subjective bias, but it's very informative to ask people how much they can contribute to a local level or a higher level governance, and what kind of systems and quality and effectiveness and accessibility of them are operating. For example, when you asked people in very rural looking, safe looking towns outside Dolo, their biggest fears and threats, it's theft. You know, these are places where we romanticize the social cohesion, the sense of community, and they're frightened of being robbed in tiny towns. So you do, through a household level questionnaire, get a sense of those higher levels, I think. Next one.
Sorry, can I just intervene?
Yes.
That was actually my question, and I'm sorry with the texting, it's a little bit tricky. It's a little bit tricky to get at the nuance of what I'm trying to understand. I've seen the presentation now numerous times, and I'm very grateful to FAO for developing this. It's very innovative. However, when presented at the Resilience 2014 conference, there was a definite explanation that the governance elements was looked at, but then in the model, it didn't really work. And I wanted to get a little bit more of an understanding. Is it because of the methodology of asking difficult questions around governance and entitlements, because of the context, and it's because it's a short-term research project, or is it actually something to do with the methodology of the modeling system? Because those are two different things. And it's a very loaded question. I'll be very honest with you about that. I'm loading this question because I think it's very important to try to identify governance entitlements within the other components of poverty or well-being that you have identified. So you've got your access to services, you've got your social protection elements. So if you go back to your framework, you've got those 5 elements of poverty, or if you flip it, your 5 elements of well-being. And we know very well through development over the many years. Governance and entitlements are critical in that. So I would like us to keep pressing on in terms of the governance entitlements area into this modeling system. I'd be really grateful to learn a little bit more about the actual sticking points that have come up from trying to do it in the first round. Thanks.
Thank you. No, it's a brilliant question, and there's lots of ways I should reply to that, and also Marlene, who's here from UNICEF Somalia, may want to add something. But first of all, there's been a tension in how we use the index versus how we use the descriptive statistics and the analysis beneath that. We certainly are finding it's much more useful to dig into sort of cross tabs between those descriptive statistics and look for those causal relationships that inform our theory of change. It's very superficial to derive analysis from an index. It's useful for lots of things. It's useful for advocacy and comms in some ways, but it's really when you dig beneath and triangulate with how communities see it themselves that you start to be able to build this picture. The difficulty of asking, yes, I think it does warrant its own separate form of inquiry, this idea, because it's too big to just take as sort of trivial entry points here and there. I mean, the underpinnings of the political economy and these wider enabling environmental factors are too big to just hint at and flick at from a household level questionnaire. So you do need a much wider understanding